a blurry photo on your phone is, well, it's an instant delete, right?
Oh, yeah, 100%. Straight to the trash.
Exactly. It's an error, like a mistake to be quickly erased so you can get back to trying to capture that, crisp, perfectly sharp shot.
Right, the one everyone actually wants.
Yeah. But today, we're looking at something wild in this deep dive. We have a guide that shows how elite wedding photographers are intentionally sabotaging their own images.
It sounds so counterintuitive.
It really does. They are deliberately dropping their shutter speeds to these dangerously slow levels. And the mission of our deep dive today is to figure out why. Like, they're doing this to capture something a perfectly frozen image never could, which is the actual feeling and kinetic energy of the day.
Yeah, and it is a complete paradigm shift, honestly, because, think about how human biological vision actually works. We do not see the world in these frozen 1/4000th of a second slices.
No, of course not.
Right, so if someone runs past you, your eyes perceive a continuous flow of motion. The brain basically stitches together a narrative of movement.
That's more of a fluid thing.
Exactly. So when a photographer freezes a high-energy moment completely, it can actually feel incredibly sterile to the human eye. It kind of strips the momentum right out of the room.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if I'm putting myself in the shoes of a couple planning a wedding, they are likely paying top dollar for a professional.
Oh, yeah. Thousands of dollars, easily.
Right. And the universal expectation for professional photography is absolute razor-sharp clarity.
Always has been.
Yeah, so if I look at a photo of, say, a grand entrance into a reception hall, and the couple is just this smeared streak of color across the frame.
It's a total blur.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My first thought isn't, wow, what profound art. My first thought is, wow, the photographer tripped.
Yeah, I totally get that. It feels like a mistake.
So how do you justify selling a smudged painting to a client who specifically hired you for a high-definition memory?
Well, what's fascinating here is that you justify it by delivering a sensory experience rather than just like a visual checklist.
A visual checklist. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, because a perfectly sharp, static image is undoubtedly necessary for documenting the facts, right? Like, here's the bride, here's the groom, here's the exact center of the room they were standing in.
The evidence of the day.
Exactly, the evidence. But an image with intentional motion blur, it captures the rush of air. It captures the chaos of the cheering crowd, the sheer velocity of the bouquet being thrown, or, the dizziness of a spin on the dance floor.
So it's capturing an emotion.
Yes, it bridges the gap between a static, factual document and the atmospheric reality of what the day actually felt like to live through.
Wow, okay, so it makes the photo feel loud. Like, you can actually hear the cheering and feel the vibration in the floorboards.
Precisely. It brings you back into the sensory reality of the event. Motion blur mimics the biological way we experience adrenaline and excitement.
Okay, I get the psychological appeal. I really do. But let's talk about the actual execution here, because trying to do this on a wedding day goes against every instinct ingrained in a photographer.
Oh, absolutely. It breaks all the rules.
Right, like the golden rule of handheld shooting is the focal length rule. Your shutter speed should never drop below your focal length.
Standard safety net, yeah.
Yeah, so if I'm shooting on an 85mm lens, I shouldn't be dropping below 1/100th of a second. Yet to get this blur, the guide says photographers are dropping to 1/10th or 1/20th of a second.
Which is insanely slow.
It is. At those speeds, the entire image should just be a muddy, unusable mess of micro jitters from the photographer's own hands. How are they actually pulling this off without ruining the shot?
It requires a massive recalibration of how you physically handle the camera. You aren't just, casually pressing a button anymore. You are managing a highly controlled physical state.
A physical state.
Yeah. To shoot handheld at 1/10th of a second without turning the entire subject into an unrecognizable ghost, you basically have to turn your own body into a human tripod.
Which means what, exactly, in terms of body mechanics?
It means we are talking about locking your elbows rigidly into your ribs.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it means planting your feet shoulder-width apart to stabilize your core. You have to control your breathing, often holding your breath or squeezing the shutter in the exact moment between an exhale and an inhale.
Like a sniper or something?
Kinda, yeah.
Yeah.
You are deliberately allowing the subject's movement to streak across the digital sensor, but you are fighting with every muscle in your upper body to keep the camera chassis itself dead still.
Because any little shake.
Right, if the camera axis tilts even a fraction of a millimeter during that 1/10th of a second, the intentional blur turns into an accidental, messy camera shake.
Which introduces a massive exposure nightmare.
But the lighting is a whole other issue.
Yeah, because if you're dropping your shutter speed to 1/10 of a second, you're suddenly flooding that sensor with an absurd amount of light.
It's just drowning it in light.
Right. Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because it's like trying to fill a bucket with a hose.
I like that analogy.
Yeah, so if you leave the water running longer, which is the slow shutter speed, you let in way more water, or light. To keep the photo from overflowing into pure white overexposure, you have to precisely tweak the aperture and ISO to manage the flow.
Exactly. Even if you completely bottom out your ISO to 100 to make the sensor as insensitive to light as possible, if you're shooting an outdoor ceremony or a bright sunlit room, that image is going to blow out instantly.
Just pure white.
Pure white.
Mm.
So to counteract that flood of light, you'd normally have to stop your aperture way down, closing the lens opening to f/16 or f/22.
But doing that completely ruins the shallow depth of field, right? That beautiful blurry background that wedding photographers rely on to separate the couple from the background.
That is the exact tightrope walk they are navigating. To maintain that beautiful f1.8 or f2.8 background blur while simultaneously dragging the shutter at incredibly slow speeds, professionals cannot just rely on the camera's internal settings.
So what do?
They rely heavily on ND filters, neutral density filters.
Right, which are essentially sunglasses for your camera lens.
Exactly. An ND filter screws onto the front of the lens and artificially darkens the incoming light. This allows the photographer to cut the ambient light hitting the sensor by 3, 6, or even 10 stops.
That makes total sense.
Yeah, by artificially restricting the light at the front of the lens, they can keep that wide open aperture for the background blur and keep that dangerously slow shutter speed for the motion blur, even in the middle of a bright, sunny afternoon.
All right, so we've got the ND filter screwed on, we're controlling our breathing, we've locked our elbows. Applying this kinetic energy to a dark, chaotic dance floor makes intuitive sense. But utilizing this during the actual ceremony,
It sounds risky.
that feels incredibly risky. The ceremony is traditionally all about quiet, graceful, highly structured moments. Are photographers really dragging the shutter while the bride is walking down the aisle?
They are, and it yields some of the most striking, ethereal images of the entire day.
Really?
Yeah, think about it. When a bride walks down the aisle, a 1/20th shutter speed physically transforms the reality of the heavy fabric of her dress.
How so?
Instead of a static frozen cone of white cloth, the hemline blurs into this flowing, continuous wave of motion as it brushes against the floor.
Oh, that sounds beautiful.
It is. The real artistic challenge here is keeping her face tack sharp so you can see her emotion, while the dress and the environment blur around her.
And how exactly do you guarantee the face stays sharp if the person is actively walking toward you or past you? That sounds like trying to thread a needle while riding a slow-moving roller coaster.
It is so tough. It all comes down to mastering the biomechanics of panning.
Panning, okay.
Yeah, you aren't just holding the camera still and letting her walk through the frame.
Yeah.
You are tracking her movement perfectly. And panning isn't just turning your wrists. That introduces a vertical tilt that ruins the shot.
So what's the right way?
A proper pan requires you to plant your feet facing the point where the subject will be at the end of the motion. Then, you twist your upper body toward where they're coming from and smoothly pivot from your hips as they move past you.
Wow, so your hips act like the fluid head of a high-end video tripod.
Exactly. If you match the speed of your hip pivot to their exact walking pace, their face remains anchored in the exact same spot on your camera sensor for the entire duration of that slow exposure.
That is wild.
Yeah, so the face is sharp, but the background smears into directional lines of motion.
But that requires an insane amount of spatial awareness. What happens to the guests in the background while you're doing this hip pivoting pan?
Well, they get blurred too.
Right, because you've got 50 or 100 people sitting in folding chairs right behind the couple. If you are deliberately smearing the background, don't the guests just turn into a distracting, muddy mess?
Actually, no. Blurring the guests is a massive psychological advantage for the narrative of the photograph.
Really? Why?
Think about it. If you shoot a ceremony at 1/1000th of a second, every single face in the background is frozen and recognizable.
True.
And the human eye naturally gravitates toward sharp text and sharp human faces. So a perfectly frozen background means the viewer's eye is constantly darting away from the bride to look at an uncle checking his watch in the third row, or a guest holding up an iPad.
Right. The background competes with subject.
Precisely.
Uh-huh.
By dragging the shutter and panning, the guests are rendered as soft, directional streaks of color. They lose their hard, distracting edges and become a dynamic texture.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it provides this wonderful immersive sense of being surrounded by a living, breathing crowd without pulling focus from the main subject. The couple remains the undisputed anchor of the image.
It gives you the atmosphere of the room while subtly forcing the viewer to look exactly where you want them to. I love that.
It's very clever storytelling.
Yeah, but if the ceremony is about subtle grace and controlling the background, the reception is an absolute explosion of kinetic energy. The dance floor has to be the ultimate playground for this aesthetic.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
The dance floor is where motion blur stops being just a subtle enhancement and becomes the primary subject of the photograph.
And it's way darker, usually.
Yes, and this is where photographers introduce external light sources, specifically flash, to freeze the chaos. If we connect this to the bigger picture of the text, this advanced technique is often referred to as rear curtain sync.
Wait, rear curtain sync? Walk me through what that actually means physically inside the camera, because normally when I take a flash photo on my phone or a point and shoot, the flash just fires instantly.
Right, that is called front curtain sync. The shutter opens, the flash fires immediately, and then the camera records whatever happens next. But with rear curtain sync, on a slow shutter speed, say a full half-second exposure, the mechanics are flipped. The shutter opens, and the camera sensor just sits there, absorbing all the ambient light in the room.
So it's capturing all the movement first.
Exactly. It drinks in the DJ's colored strobes, the movement of the dancers spinning, creating long, vibrant streaks of light across the sensor, and then, at the very last millisecond, right before the shutter curtain closes, the flash fires.
Ah. So the flash acts as a final, definitive stamp on the image. It burns a sharp, frozen, perfectly lit image of the couple at the very end of their movement. But they have this incredible comet tail of ambient light trailing behind them from the half second before the flash went off.
You nailed it. It visually replicates the adrenaline of the dance floor. You get the sharp, recognizable joy on their faces anchored over a wild, impressionistic painting of neon light.
That sounds visually stunning, but there are also in-camera physical manipulations happening on the dance floor too, right? We're not just panning or using flash.
No, there are other tricks.
Yeah, the source mentions a technique called the zoom blur, where you're physically manipulating the lens itself during the exposure. To me, that sounds exactly like the visual effect of jumping to light speed in Star Wars.
The Millennium Falcon effect.
Exactly. The couple is sharp in the middle, and the entire room is just violently streaking outward in a starburst pattern.
It is the exact same visual principle as jumping to light speed. But the physical execution of a zoom blur is remarkably difficult. To pull this off on a dark dance floor, you aren't just casually twisting the lens barrel.
What do you have to do?
You have to use that human tripod stance we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Elbows locked into your ribs to act as a solid base. Then, you have to physically roll your fingers around the zoom ring smoothly over exactly half a second.
While someone is spinning in front of you.
Exactly.
Man.
And crucially, you have to ensure the camera body itself doesn't shift even a millimeter off its axis. If the camera tilts up or down while you're twisting that zoom ring, those beautiful, straight, radiating light streaks turn into jagged, messy lightning bolts, and the subject's face gets completely obliterated.
It's like trying to rub your stomach, pat your head, and balance on a tightrope all at the same time in the dark while heavily intoxicated wedding guests are actively bumping into your shoulders.
It is a profound test of muscle memory.
Which brings up a really important point about the reality of professional wedding photography. Getting this shot in camera is a monumental physical achievement, but it's really only half the battle, right? I mean, try to focus on use Weddizer website for photography and media purposes. You can find best hiring for wedding events guidance through article section on website related to niche.
Right. The online communities and resources.
Yeah, and when you read what professionals on those sites actually do behind the scenes, you realize the digital darkroom is where this aesthetic is truly forged. The magic doesn't stop when the shutter closes.
Not at all. A raw image file straight out of the camera, especially one shot with a slow shutter speed in mixed reception lighting, is often quite flat and muddy.
Oh, really? It doesn't look magical instantly.
Rarely. The post-processing phase in software like Adobe Lightroom or Photoshop is where the intentionality of the blur is refined and perfected. Photographers will heavily manipulate the contrast and use highly targeted digital masking.
What does that look like in practice?
They might drop the exposure of the chaotic, blurred edges of the frame, basically darkening the distracting streaks. And then they drastically lift the highlights and clarity specifically